Welcome to another Able podcast, our leadership series, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Stuart Bruce, who is co-CEO of Purposeful Relations. Stuart, welcome to the show. Lovely to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here, John. I've enjoyed many previous episodes.
Excellent. Well, why don't you start by telling the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do at Purposeful Relations?
Yeah, my background is in public relations and communications, which I've been doing for more years than I care to remember, at least 30. But throughout that time, I've always been fascinated by innovation. And why do we do things like this? Is there a better way of doing it? Why do we even do that? Is there a better way to achieve the outcome that we're looking for? And then about 3-4 years ago, I teamed up with an old friend to start Purposeful Relations. And our purpose is to help communications teams to improve performance through innovation. And usually what that means is, especially today, it's around more innovative use of AI and understanding AI. And then it's also about data and measurement, because for some reason, lots of comms and PR people, maths wasn't their favorite subject at school.
Oh, obviously the world of AI is what I'm particularly interested in. So let's just jump straight into some questions, if that's all right. You've argued previously that AI itself should be treated as a new stakeholder for comms teams, which is really interesting because I hear the same thing from HR teams, by the way, from AI adoption inside the function. Can you unpack that distinction and describe what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. AI as a stakeholder is a concept that I came up with in early. Well, it was actually over Christmas 2024. And I was basically sort of looking and thinking, why are we spending so much time on adoption when actually AI has a much bigger impact than just how we use it? So for example, AI creates new content. So just like a journalist or a politician or a think tank would create new content by synthesizing information from multiple sources, that's what AI is doing. Every time somebody puts in a question or a prompt, it's synthesizing new information. That means it's a stakeholder. So we've got to start thinking about first of all, how we can understand that process more, but then secondly, what can we do to influence it? How do we make sure that we show up accurately, that it's saying the right things about maybe policies or issues that we care about? So that's where the concept came from. Then what was quite interesting is I wasn't 100% sure I was on the right lines, because it was nobody else was talking about it. So I talked to some clients and we were doing stuff internally. But then in April 2024, Oxford Said Business School came out with a paper which basically said the same thing. And I thought, I'm not crazy. This actually is a thing. So yeah, when Rupert Younger, who was the head of this Oxford, the Centre of Corporate Communications Excellence there, came up with this, I thought, well, yeah, we've got to lean into it lock, stock and barrel and do a lot more thinking and research around it.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned there synthesization of content, which seems to be a hot topic today, because I was on a call with a chap called Joe Clark, who's head of insights at Nomad Foods. Nomad are the company that owns frozen food brands like Bird's Eye and various other things. And he was talking about how they use synthetic research to replace the old qual research they used to do. To the uneducated listeners amongst us, can you describe what you mean by synthetic research or synthesization of content?
Okay, so important distinction. So I wasn't talking about synthetic research, which is a different concept. What AI is doing when it creates an answer is it is creating new content. So if you look at how traditional search worked, it was incredibly simplistic. Basically, you needed to rank high so as people could see your content, but it was your content. It was stuff that had been created, or maybe media sites. AI is not doing that. AI is giving you something that it has synthesized, that it has created, using all of those different sources that are available to it. So it's a different thing to synthetic audiences.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's to your point around, it's same as a journalist or a think tank. They are using their sources to create the content. The AI is using a different set of sources, sometimes the same, to create its content. And that's your point.
Absolutely. And I think this is where it gets complicated as well. And whether this is the concept you can explain in a video, because it's a two-way process. So if you're an organization or an individual creating information and publishing it, then AI is going to see that. It's going to be able to read it. But what you're creating is actually possibly being influenced by what you've researched on AI. So all of these things are it's a two-way process. It's not linear. And if you think about how other stakeholders are going to operate, they're using AI as well. So if a politician is kind of going to say something about you, or a journalist is going to write something about you, the chances are they're going to use AI to help them to research it, to help them to do that. But at the same time, the thing that they then create is going to influence what AI says to the next stakeholder, the next person that uses it.
So, how should a comms team's stakeholder map change to account for these AI systems, in your opinion?
Okay, well, the first thing they've got to do is, first of all, we have multiple AI models. Believe me, if you do enough of these audits, they're going to say they can be saying very different things about the same organization, the same individual, or the same topic. So the first thing is doing as comprehensive a map as possible. You actually want to so very like traditional stakeholder mapping, except you're doing it with AI language models. You want to understand what they're going to say about a range of different topics and issues. And I think one of the problems you often get is people look at it in too simplistic a way. That's why there's a lot of talk about snake oil in this space, because there is a kind of 101 different tools out there that claim to measure your presence or your visibility in AI answers. And the reality is they can't possibly work. And the reason they can't possibly work is for traditional search, you've got access to data. For traditional media monitoring, you've got access to data. For traditional social listening, you've got access to data. Guess what? With AI answers, you don't have access to the prompts that people are actually putting in, and you don't have access to the answers that AI is given. So the best these tools can do is kind of directional telemetry. So what's the key part of it? Isn't the tool that you use, it's the methodology behind it. And what we always do is use multiple tools, because you can't rely on a single one. But if you use a basket of different tools and then kind of analyze the answers, that's where you can actually get quite a clear directional picture.
Okay, so when you say you're using multiple different tools, can you give me an example of something that you've done that would highlight how best to use that?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to give you, well, first of all, just to give you an indication of the size of this market. So one of the tools that we use is a tool called Profound,
Okay.
which is a London startup, started about 2 years ago. Earlier this year, they got 950 million in investment, which values them at a kind of unicorn size. It's huge, but they're only just one player in the market. So there's a whole host of these different tools. There's a company called Peak out of Germany, but there's lots more. And what we'll do is we'll take a selection of those tools and to do an audit of an organization. And the reason I kind of focus on the tools is there's two different categories. Those that use a panel of real user prompts.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that sounds good in theory, but then you're going to say, well, where do these prompts come from? So have you ever shared your prompts with one of these companies? No, and I don't know anybody that does. Now, Peak is quite kind of transparent about how they do it. They basically they buy the data in from companies that get you to install browser extensions, which scrape your prompts. So that's how they're getting the data. So you've got an instant issue there, as if you're kind of researching a consumer brand. That's actually reasonably okay. I mean, there's the ethical dimension of where their prompts come from, but in terms of the information you're getting, lots of consumers are going to have these extensions on their computer, so you're going to get their prompts. In a corporate or institutional environment, you're not. There ain't many corporates or institutions where you could install any old browser extension on your work computer. So that's invisible using tools like that. So the alternative approach, and this is why your kind of question about synthetic audiences was quite interesting, and synthetic research, is you can create personas, which is the approach that we take. So we'll identify different types of stakeholder personas. It might be a journalist, it might be a customer, it might be an employee, it might be a politician, but we'll kind of create these personas and then create a series of prompts that we think that persona is going to use. We can do that in kind of two ways. Well, three ways. Sometimes it's going to be kind of human insight. There's also going to be AI to help us to do it. But there's also actual real talking to people, focus groups. Actually have discussions with people in those persona categories, and you can get then a really good grasp of what those prompts should look like. And then you've got a really solid base for sampling and understanding what AI is going to be saying about an organization.
So there's still, quite interesting, there's still a place there for old school tactics like a focus group then.
Absolutely. And it's a really good way of kind of validating those other two methods, because it would be quite expensive if you just did focus groups. But actually, if you do those other two bits of research and then just test it, just see, if we actually speak to people, are we getting similar answers back? And if you are, you can kind of, you can be assured you've done it right.
Nice, nice. Okay. Well, I'm going to change tack slightly and move on to some other different subjects. So you've written about PR, marketing, SEO, and advertising all fighting for ownership of GEO. Is there a single owner, in your opinion? And if so, why?
No, there shouldn't be a single owner. And that's because of the complexity of it. And you might say, I would say this because I come from a PR background. I do think communications and PR should lead on it, but that's not because we're expert in all the areas that it covers. It's because we've got this 360-degree view of an organization. We're not just interested in customers. We're not just interested in employees. We're not just interested in kind of search. We look at everything, and risk is really high up on our agenda. You know, very often the comms person is the set of the naysayer and the doom monger in the room, and kind of saying, oh yeah, but have you thought of this? This could go wrong. And that's a really important part of doing this. So that's why I would argue that comms should lead the process. But of course, there are some expert domains in there. You know, some of the things you need to do to kind of be cited properly in AI answers is around technical skills, where kind of traditional SEO people would have expertise, but you can work with them and utilize their expertise and their skill. What you don't want is them leading it, because there are so many external factors that kind of influence it. So, for example, if we wanted to make sure that you were a trusted source for AI, it's going to be doing things like, well, is John's biography on the company website the same as his LinkedIn profile? Has he been quoted in the media? Is he speaking at events? Has he won awards? So all of these different signals are things that AI will look at. None of them are things that kind of SEO people would traditionally be involved in.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So, I mean, you mentioned risk there. What happens to brand and reputational risk when GEO sits inside a marketing or SEO team instead of comms? Like, how does that ladder up?
I think it's that they will look at it at too narrow a perspective. So one of the things when you talk, and this is one of the flaws of a lot of the tools out there, they're all obsessed with visibility. And do we get ranked in an AI answer? Whereas actually the real risk lies in, how do you get ranked? What does it say about you? And I can actually give you a practical example of that. I spoke at an event earlier this year where one of the other people on the panel was the head of comms for the British Heart Foundation.
Mhm.
And she was talking about how in AI answers, it's quite possible for it to give you wrong information about what to do if you have a heart attack or if you've got problems.
Really?
For them, it's a really big priority correcting those AI answers and what can they do to influence them. That isn't traditionally the type of thing, that kind of digital would be looking at. They'd be looking at, does the British Heart Foundation rank high? Is it high? Do people know to go there for advice? How likely are people to do donations? Rather than looking at that kind of downstream of how accurate are the answers? What are they actually making people do? And how are they changing people's behavior?
That's super interesting. I mean, hallucinations were a big problem 12, 9, 6 months ago. In my experience, it's dissipated a bit as the models have got a bit better, and they changed some of the underlying thinking around how the LLM feel with the binary yes, no, must give an answer thing.
But there's two different issues working at play here. So one is hallucinations, where AI doesn't know something and makes it up.
Yeah.
But the other one is where it's factually incorrect because of the source material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which could still happen in search, right?
Yes, absolutely. But there, it's clearer because you know where the information is coming from. One of the problems with AI answers is even though it gives citations, people don't necessarily look at them. They read the answer and they kind of treat that as the answer. They won't kind of go and say, oh, there's 12 different sources here. One of them was British Heart Foundation. Another one was this kind of fringe website in the USA.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of that comes back to the use of the tools themselves, right? I mean, if we just talk about LLMs, because it's what most people are familiar with, the way you have it set up and the level of robustness you give it about its sources and how it finds information, and then that ladders down into the prompt itself and how much detail you give it about where it wants to look for answers will have an impact on those answers. If you just go, how do I treat a heart attack? And don't give it any of that information, then you're likely to get a different set of answers to. You're right. You should be looking on the British Heart Foundation website, the NHS website, and whatever else it is. I want absolutely scientifically checked and verified advice on how to treat a heart attack, or whatever it is. It's just that kind of level of information that I still think people are struggling with. And this is basic prompting ultimately, but it is also in the way that the systems are set up. and which I don't think a lot of people spend enough time on when they onboard a new system, whether it's Claude or Codex or OpenAI or Perplexity, whatever it is, all the way down to the more niche stuff, which is, for individual teams.
No, 100%. I mean, if you looked at kind of the personal settings on my AI tools, for a start, lots of people don't go into the customization options,
Mm.
so they've never even set them. But mine's got all sorts of things in there, like don't be sycophantic, don't try to please me. If you don't know the answer, say you don't know the answer, and it's got loads of kind of custom instructions like that. So literally, I can't remember when I last saw a hallucination because I'm so stringent on kind of trying to stop them. But
Yeah, I mean,
most people don't.
I'm quite similar. I think I started with "Don't blow smoke up my arse" because I found that
Yeah,
the tools were constantly like, "Oh, that's a great idea, John." It's like, "No, it's not. It's terrible. I want you to criticize it."
yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
Um, anyway, we digress, as I often do on these things. Let's get back into it. So this links, my next question links to what we've already been talking about. Data and measurement is one of your kind of core practice areas. When it comes to measuring AI or geo measurements, or how are organizations doing it? Are they getting it wrong? Are they simply not doing it? You've kind of touched on this already, but what would your advice be to people?
I think most aren't yet doing it. They kind of recognize that there's an issue, but they're not 100% sure kind of how to proceed. If you look at LinkedIn, it is full of kind of people talking about this. And I
Mm.
already mentioned kind of the 101 tools out there, and they vary massively in price. And you basically got three different types. You've got kind of the ones that come from the SEO companies that are pivoting. You've got the kind of the new ones that have kind of just been kind of their startups. But then you've also got some from the kind of traditional PR comms reputation measurement market who are now beginning to add these features to their tools. Most kind of corporates or organizations, they're just confused. They don't know what to kind of to buy, what they're meant to be measuring. And it doesn't help that kind of two of those categories at least focus very much on visibility, which anybody that kind of knows about kind of measurement in the communications space is we've got this hideous thing called advertising value equivalence, where basically people would measure a piece of media coverage and say, "Ooh, that would cost X pounds if you paid for it as an advert," and then they
Right.
times it by a random number because editorial's worth more than advertising, and it is total bullshit. Pardon my language. It's just fraudulent. It's made up, but despite that, because it's a simple number, some people still use it. And my fear is that visibility is the new AVE because it's a really simple thing. Yeah, look, we come up in 80% of answers. So what? What you actually want to know is, well, what does that mean for your stakeholders? Is that going to change their behavior? Is that going to kind of change what they think and believe? We've got to start, what companies need to be focusing on is not just looking at kind of, do we appear in answers, but how is it affecting stakeholder behavior? Are they going to buy something? Are they going to apply for a job? Is it going to help a politician make a decision about some new legislation? And it's linking the outcome rather than just looking at output, which is visibility.
Yeah, I mean, you've answered my next question already. I was going to ask, what metrics do comms teams over-index on? Well, it sounds like visibility is the one that you would be on that.
Yeah,
Can I
absolutely.
also ask you, what metrics do comms teams ignore at their peril? And you've just listed off a load of those. Is there anything else in that kind of ilk?
I think it's been really clear. Well, it's probably worth here making some reference to some standards.
Mhm.
So there's a kind of couple of things that can help comms teams or indeed a broader organization approach this in a mature manner. So the first is the AMEC GEO principles. So AMEC is the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communications. I'm not going to say that
Blimey.
again. But in June this year, they published the 7 GEO principles. So it doesn't tell you how to do it, but it tells you what good measurement looks like, and you should be able to tick all of those. And then the second one, which I actually helped to write, came out last month from the Public Relations and Communications Association, and it's basically a how-to guide. So it kind of translates those principles into some practical ideas and steps of things that you can do. I mean, there's too many of them to kind of go through them all, but to give you one example, is don't just use one tool because it's going to give you all that's going to tell you is what that tool thinks. You've got to use a mixed methodology to be able to get any reasonable insight, and also understand that it's a snapshot in time. Just because it's saying this today doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the same answers tomorrow because of the way kind of AI models actually work.
Okay, interesting. while we're talking about kind of guidelines and rules, the EU AI Act transparency rules are, I believe, now enforceable. And I also believe that you've noted before that most PR and comms teams aren't ready. What does non-readiness mean for specifically mid-market businesses, but those who might not be experienced in PR across the EU?
I think the main thing is people look and they say, "Oh, transparent. We've got to be transparent about this." Actually, if you already had good governance in place, nothing has changed.
Right.
Because basically, if you're making something is substantially created by AI without human involvement or without human oversight and approval, then it was already kind of good governance that you should be disclosing that fact. What the EU AI Act does is it just puts that into legislation with some fairly scary fines of kind of €15,000 or 4% of global turnover, I think they are. Whichever's the highest. So I think that's most organizations don't have governance in place. And if they do, it's something that they set up really early. It's now out of date. It's got kind of draconian. I mean, I did a project with a client the other week, and its AI policy was totally at odds with what I've been asked to come in and do with them. If I'd done like even just 10, 20% of what they're wanting to do, they've got a policy that says they shouldn't be doing it, but
Right.
nobody had actually updated it because it's been written by legal and IT in the early days.
Yeah. Yeah, things move so quick. You've got to constantly be looking at these policies. I think, if not, probably quarterly, I think is probably a good cadence at the moment, based on the rate of change. I imagine that you work with a range of different teams, so agencies, governments, nonprofits, corporates. In your experience, who's furthest ahead on AI right now and who's furthest behind? And I realise this is a generalisation before you answer.
Okay. Well, the answer might surprise you. It's government. In the comms space, it is government by a considerable margin. So
Okay.
the UK Government Communications Service, there's about 7,000 people, and it's all of the comms people in things like arm's length bodies, central government departments, so things like that.
Yeah.
And they were very early to recognise the opportunities of AI, and they developed a tool called GCS Assist, which is basically got about 50 plus different communications tasks and workflows that it can help people with. So, for example, it can review a crisis communications plan. They now have, and before people get access to GCS Assist, they actually have to go through a training program. So you're not just given the keys. And the analogy I always use there is it's a bit like giving people a company car without checking they've got a driving license. When you give them an AI tool, you've got to actually make sure they know how to drive before you give it to them. And that's what GCS does. And it was quite interesting that they developed that approach, and it's this approach we use with clients. And they're doing some amazing things. I think they've got something like 80-90% adoption now across those 7,000 people. So people that are using kind of an AI tool for at least part of their job on a kind of daily or weekly basis. And give you one practical example of how they used it. There are something like more than 400 communications plans across government, crisis communications plans. Everything from kind of environment agency to a central government department. And they use GCS Assist to basically assess all of these crisis communications plans and label them as kind of green, amber, or red as to how closely they complied with best practice standards and how good they were. I think it was 70% were amber or red. And they then used AI, the GCS Assist tool, to turn that round. So it's the other way around now, that they're all green.
Right.
And the AI tool actually helped to improve the plans. That's the type of thing that would have been a year, 2-year expensive program to have done previously.
Do you think there's any reason why government are so far ahead of everyone else?
I think GCS have got a history of being at the cutting edge of communications. Things like, when I talked about measurement, they were one of the first to adopt kind of best practice measurement frameworks, kind of back in kind of 2010-ish. So they've got a track record of doing it. And it's probably kind of worth shouting out kind of the previous CEO of GCS, Bohr. He kind of left in November, but he was very much the kind of the driving force behind making sure that Government Communications Service adopted AI. And when they were doing it, they were way ahead of the rest of government, and they won kind of government AI awards, etc., for that being cutting edge and making it happen.
Nice. Well, fair enough. Fair play to them. I always end up on the same question, Stuart, which you may have noticed as you've viewed a few of the other ones. So our market here at Able is scale up and mid-market leaders predominantly. If you are a senior communications individual within a mid-market organization, what would be your one piece of advice to that individual?
When they're looking at using AI, it's to improve what they do. It's not about saving time. Um, and I'll use the GCS example again. When like a single manager, or which is often what you've got in scale-ups and mid-sized companies, you've only got one or two people in the comms team. It's
Mm,
really hard for them to develop best practice because they've got nobody to bounce it off. AI is the perfect foil for red teaming, bouncing your ideas off and basically upping your game. And that's where GCS found some of their biggest improvements. It was within the really, really small teams where they didn't have anybody to turn to for help. So it's to embrace it, but not to do your job for you, but to improve how you do your job.
nice. I like that a lot. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Stuart. Thank you very much for your time. Best of luck with everything you're doing with Purposeful Relations over the coming weeks and months. And yeah, I look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Thank you, John. It's been a delight.